Welcome to the Mac Emerge podcast. My name is Teresa Chan, and with me I have
Kevin Dom,
Brendan Trotter,
and Joanna Dida,
and we'll be your podcast team.
Our goal is to connect all the McMaster-affiliated emergency physicians so we all get to know each other a little better.
We have so much great talent and expertise in this region. We want to highlight it into one regional podcast.
Each podcast features one invited guest to speak about their expertise or interests.
Additionally, we will feature external speakers who have delivered regional rounds at one of our teaching sites.
And don't forget about the residents.
We'll be featuring stories about our residents and what they've been up to as well. All right, are you ready? Let's get started with this month's episode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this month's episode of the podcast. Before we start, the team just wanted to mention the upcoming 10EM conference. Save the date for Friday, October 1st, and check out the website at 10emconference.org or 10emconference.org. Thanks and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brendan Trotter with Mac Emerge Podcast. We're here with Amna Zaki to speak about some coroner aspects of her career.
Hello. How are you, Brendan? How's it going?
Good, Amna. Thanks. I'm tired, as you already commented on earlier today. So why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Probably most of them know you already, but...
Yeah, so I'm an emergency physician at Joe's. I actually did medical school in Pakistan, moved here, did my residency at McMaster, and then stayed on in Hamilton, and now work full-time as an emerge doc at St. Joe's, and recently started working as a coroner as well.
We went to class together. We were classmates.
We were classmates.
Residency,
yes, we wrote the exam together.
Yeah, wasn't that great? What made you want to branch out from just emerge? This seems to be a common thing that people talk about in terms of trying to get away from some shift work and getting some kind of normalcy in other aspects of employment.
I wouldn't say that it gets you away from shift work, and like the hours are not 9 to 5.
I guess so.
But still, it is very different. I mean, unlike emerge, where it's so fast-paced, it's pretty high stress. I really wanted to try something that was not so stressful, and coroner work is really not stressful at all. Also, it's not, like you're running like a crazy person in the department. It's, your own pace. It's quite peaceful. I also wanted to try and learn something new, learn something different. Coroner work gives you a different perspective. I mean, we deal with very sick patients in emerge. We deal with dying patients pretty routinely, but as a coroner, you kind of see the other side. You see things after death, and the aspect, the perspective of the family and kind of what happens afterwards. So it is very different. But no, it's not. If you're thinking of a 9 to 5. No weekends, that's not what it is.
Yeah, that's a good point, because so many other people do things like pain or addictions or sexual assault, and so those things are, not all of it.
You could get multiple calls between midnight and 7 a.m. It's not 9 to 5, but it's still very different. It's quite different from emerge life.
Yeah. And when did you start with the
It's been about 2.5 years.
Yep. Okay. We'll talk about kind of what an average shift sounds like a little bit later on. And so how do you feel if this is going to fit into your long-term career type goals? Is this something you think you'll be doing for the long haul?
I think so. I really enjoy it. It's nice to have work that is peaceful. I think as I grow older and, kind of advance in my career, I think perhaps I might cut back on emerge shifts and maybe do more coroner work. And I mean, if somebody wanted to kind of advance in the world of, forensics and life as a coroner, I mean, there's way to advance there too. You could become a regional supervising coroner. So, I mean, that would be more of a 9 to 5 job.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's certainly always an option if someone wanted to advance and not just do investigative work.
So probably a lot of listeners will know Karen Schiff.
Karen Schiff, who was our senior.
Yeah, was our senior residency.
Yeah. 3 years? 4 years? Or 3 years?
Yeah, she was senior and we were junior. Yeah, probably 3 years.
3 years, yeah. So she's the regional supervising coroner in Hamilton, and she loves it.
Did not know that. So is there anything else aside from coroner work that you might think about doing outside of the emerge?
No, I don't know, Brendan. Do you have any ideas? Is there anything else?
Well, we both talked about kind of pain clinic stuff is something that is a little bit hard potentially for us to get into these days. But
I don't know. For now, I think it's just coroner work. Already juggling 2 schedules can be a bit.
Yes, it's not looking for a third job. Yeah, I definitely found that when I was working multiple emerges. Yeah, just juggling.
Yeah,
2 positions, it just adds a whole layer of complexity, which makes life more stressful.
We've got enough stress as is, so.
Yeah. Yeah. How does the coroner service work in Ontario? What's the general organization of the system here?
I'm an investigating coroner, and then sort of above that you've got regional supervising coroners. So Ontario is divided into 4 regions, so central, west, east, north, pretty straightforward.
Can remember that.
And then above that you've got the chief coroner of Ontario. So I mean, it's just every region has its kind of setup, which is independent of other regions.
Okay. How does your job contrast and compare with forensics, pathologists, and all that kind of stuff?
So the coroner is kind of the person who coordinates between the different parties that are involved. I would be the one who would be talking to police, if physician, if it's a case in the hospital, and then the forensic pathologist if we have to do an autopsy. Every case is unique, and then there are different parties involved, and the investigating coroner is sort of the person who puts everyone together. Like the forensic pathologist does not talk to the family, right? So it's the coroner
right.
who will talk to the family. They don't talk to the family. That's not their job at all. You need some coordination, communication between the police, the pathologist, the family. If there are other physicians involved, or if you need sort of, sometimes you have cases where someone may have had some congenital problems, so say it's a sudden death case and you need to figure out what their history was. So the person may have died as an adult, but you may need to get records from sick kids. So all that coordinating part is kind of done by the investigating coroner. And obviously it's a teamwork. And then everybody works together to have an answer to the question.
And then, so as an investigation progresses, are you kind of talking to the family and then talking to the pathologist and then talking to the family again? You're kind of moving back and forth to put together pieces of the puzzle?
Yep.
Talking briefly about this before we started recording. So Ontario is somewhat unique in terms of the fact that all coroners are medical doctors.
Correct.
And that is not the case everywhere, as I understand.
That is not the case everywhere. In different parts of the world and even in different parts of Canada, some places it might be police detective who's doing it. So no, Ontario is one of the unique places where it's actually a physician who works as the investigating coroner. Even in Ontario, recently we started involving nurse practitioners. So during the week, during the day, daytime hours, actually they take many of the calls that are put up to coroners. And then if it's something pretty straightforward, or if they don't think it needs to be investigated, they would take care of the case as required. And then if they need to involve the investigating coroner, and then we would get called and so on.
Do they go through the same training course you guys generally take?
I don't think so. So when I did the course, it was only for physicians. So I'm not actually sure. I'm sure they do go through some sort of training, but was not with us. I don't know if it's changed since I did the course 2.5 years ago. This was something that was introduced kind of after I started working.
So we should probably cover coroner case criteria, as that's something that people often will be confused about. And so for our listeners, what are the main reasons why you might have to call a coroner?
I mean, the main thing is if you think it's an unnatural death. So a coroner should be involved, must be involved if it's an unnatural death. And then the other big one is if it's like a sudden death. Sudden is relative, right? I mean, it can be confusing, right? So an 80-year-old dies, clutches his chest and collapses. That's a sudden death, right? I mean, he didn't expect to die, but that is not a coroner's case, right?
Okay, good. I'm still a little bit worried I might have been doing this all wrong for a while.
I mean, you can deduce based on his history, his age, that it's probably coronary artery disease related, right? Or natural. It's a natural death, right? But say, for example, I had a 21-year-old who just collapsed on her doorstep. So that's a sudden death, and you wouldn't expect a healthy 21-year-old to just, suddenly die. So in that scenario, that was a coroner's case. We investigated it, and it was actually quite sad and very interesting because it turned out after her postmortem that she had a rare genetic disease that led to sudden cardiac death.
Okay.
This person died as an adult. And when she was a child, we didn't have the technology or, we didn't have the advances that we have now. So probably her genetic problem would not have been diagnosed when she was a child, even if she had some issues, right? The technology wasn't there. So it was very fascinating to see how today we were able to do a biopsy and figure out, okay, she had this rare mutation. That kind of also ties into how does this help, right? What's the point of doing all of this, right? Okay, fine, we have a diagnosis. So what? That's relevant because, say, she has siblings.
Yep.
Right. So now we can figure out if her family members need to be tested, and maybe you can prevent another such tragedy because now we have this information that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Now, if the screening is positive, maybe they need an ICD or something as a preventative measure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so for unnatural death, I presume we're talking about accident, suicide, homicide. Is that kind of the general?
Yeah, like all gunshot wounds in Ontario. I mean, this is pretty, like,
no
question, but all gunshot wounds have to be, gunshot-related deaths have to be investigated, obviously. Any accidental death, construction or whatever, any suicide, any homicide, motor vehicle collision. And sort of the other big ones are any death in custody, so in police custody or correctional facility or psychiatric facility. So... or anywhere where you think excessive use of force. So all of those must be investigated.
Yep. So is there sometimes a contentious relationship between coroner and the police on some of these investigations, have you found? Or
no, for the most part, it's actually very interesting. It's a very collegial relationship. You're allowed to disagree, right? Like, you may have a scenario where the police officer might think that it's not something that needs to be investigated, or you might think that there's something that doesn't fit. I mean, obviously, they don't have medical expertise, right? To give you an example, and this is not my example, one of my colleagues, she had this very interesting case. So it was an elderly couple, and the wife had fallen down the stairs and then had died. And so obviously the coroner had been called. The police officer thought that this, and again, this is not my case, this was my colleague's case, and the police officer said to the coroner, it's pretty straightforward, fine, she fell down the stairs, probably don't need to do much else here. The coroner noticed that there were petechiae around the woman's face and mouth. Yeah. And so she asked the husband, what happened here? She fell down the stairs. Why does she have petechiae? And he said, I was doing mouth to mouth to, revive her. Anyway, it didn't really fit. And it turned out that husband had actually pushed her down the stairs to kill her. Yeah. And he had done the same thing to his previous deceased wife.
Sounds like The Staircase. Have you seen The Staircase on Netflix?
No.
Okay,
it's really?
Very eerily similar.
I don't know, maybe that's where he got the idea from. But then they ended up opening that investigation. Yeah. They had to investigate that death, which was ruled an accident, but may have been homicide.
So you've decided you need to call the coroner for a case. So what can you expect when you make the call? And what do you have to do with the body, with documentation? Are there any tips or tricks that you would suggest?
It's pretty straightforward. I get calls from physicians, nurses, police. They go through dispatch. Dispatch calls me. I call them back, get the story. If it's not a case, pretty straightforward. You do what you would normally do. If it is a case, almost always it means that I, or whoever the on-call coroner is, will be coming in to review the paperwork and the decedent and talk to family and so on. If you've done a resuscitation or whatever, I would just leave things as it is. No unnecessary, involvement required once you've decided you need to call the coroner. I would leave things as it is.
Don't be pulling tubes out of people or...
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's a huge deal if that was done, but because I don't know what the scenario is, like I can't give you a blanket statement, right? Like, yeah it's fine. So since most likely it's not a big deal, right? Yeah. But because I don't know what the specific scenario is, safest is just leave it alone, close a room, and once the coroner has cleared it, then, things can move on as usual. If the coroner thinks that the person needs a post-mortem exam, you don't need to worry about that. Like, the coroner can take care of body removal and whatnot. And there are funeral homes and companies that we call to have the body, and they're trained obviously in removing the body and transporting it to the forensic unit for further assessment and a post-mortem exam and so on.
You mentioned an autopsy, or we talked about that a couple times. What generally will trigger an autopsy, and is that a request that usually comes from you?
That is a request that comes from me. So again, if it's a non-natural death, if it's like that 21-year-old who collapsed, we have no idea why she passed away. Obviously, any kind of homicide, suicide, you need a post-mortem exam. Now, what shape or form that post-mortem exam takes can vary. Not everyone will require a full exam. Mm-hmm. For example, if it's a hanging or a strangulation, they might just do an external exam. Okay. They might just do a whole body CT, right? Yeah. Because that's not someone who needs a cardiac biopsy to figure out what happened. So it does depend on the situation. Sometimes for religious reasons or cultural reasons or, just personal preference or because it's so traumatic to think about, some families might not want to go for an autopsy. But then again, it depends, right? Like if it is like a criminal case, then it may be necessary, because if you don't do it, then not having a pathology report may work against the person, right? If it goes to court of law or whatnot. So, I mean, that's a discussion to be had depending on the situation. But at the end of the day, I mean, if it's deemed absolutely necessary, like the coroner's office can say, this has to be done. But we can make accommodations, right? Like say they don't want the whole, I mean, I don't know if you've seen an autopsy or on TV.
On TV.
I mean, it's pretty visceral. It's pretty intense.
Yeah.
But, again, there's ways to work around it. If a family don't want that done for whatever reason, it can just be an external exam. It can be a whole body CT. It can be just biopsy of certain tissues instead of, cutting everything open. There's lots of ways to accommodate families, what a family's requests are, or what the requirements are, and what's necessary, what's not necessary.
Are you able to walk us through a typical shift?
Well, why don't I start with one of the coolest shifts
Sure, perfect.
I had. So I was called later in the evening because this couple who had gone to the Burlington Marina, their thing was that they would go and have ice cream or whatever, or go for a walk or whatever. And then what happened was that the person who was driving, unfortunately, collapsed at the wheel. And then the car just kept going, right? And so he was supposed to park, but somehow his car squeezed between the roadblocks or the big rocks they put, so you don't go in the water. Mm-hmm. So his car somehow just slipped between the two, and then the car went in the water. And I mean, unfortunately, so his partner couldn't get out of the vehicle. There were bystanders who jumped in trying, but with the water pressure, you can't open the door. Right? So anyway, the car was completely submerged. When I got there, like just to watch the amount of coordination and, like the number of professionals that were involved in trying to get them out it was amazing to see. Like we had, I think, the Canadian dive team, Canadian version of the Marines. Yeah. We had the fire department. And so they had to get a special crane to pull the vehicle out of the water. Yeah. Like it was really amazing to see. Yeah. And then rather than kind of have to remove them from the vehicle, what we did was, so in the forensic unit in Toronto, they have a extraction bay. So it's this huge hall where you actually tow the vehicle, and then they do all of that right in that closed environment instead of, right in the parking lot. Yeah. I mean, even across Ontario, if there's like a fatal motor vehicle collision and there's a person inside, instead of removing them on the scene, what they'll do is they'll tow the vehicle to the hall, to the extraction bay, and just do everything there. And it's really, really cool, really interesting. And in this case, unfortunately, the driver actually had died before the car hit the water, right? So he had some cardiac event. Then he collapsed, and then the partner couldn't stop the car, and unfortunately she drowned. But I mean, it was very interesting to see the number of professionals that were involved and coordination that was involved. Like it was amazing.
Is there anything that scares you now, having seen all these cases, where it makes you think in ways that other people may not, and how you prepare? Drunk drivers.
Yeah. One of the most tragic cases I had was this woman. She was just walking her dog. She was just walking her dog, and this drunk driver hit her and then, dragged her several dozen feet. She died. The dog died. And while we were there, her son came out looking for her because mom hadn't come home yet. Yeah. So that's one that comes to me frequently. Yeah. And like my 12-year-old, I tell him, look, when you're walking home, you make sure you keep an eye on whatever car is near you, because you never know. Yeah, can't trust everyone else. Right? And, so I think that's one of the most horrible ones I had.
Yeah, for sure. How long is an average shift that you do when you're on call?
Typically, we do 24-hour call.
Okay. And how many calls do you get on average?
You may get none, and you may get several. Yep. So, and it also depends on what region you cover. So I cover Halton, which is Burlington and Oakville. It's not as busy, but Hamilton is crazy busy. So,
doesn't surprise me, I guess.
I mean, if you want busy, it's work in Hamilton. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, fair enough. Is there any big difference in how coroner's cases are managed from an inpatient standpoint versus an outpatient? So
not so much so. I mean, all forensic autopsies are done in Toronto, so for my region, it's Toronto, depending on the region, right? So not most hospitals don't do forensic autopsies. They if an autopsy is required, they have to be transferred, like whether it's an MBC or drowning or whatever, or something in a house or hospital, it doesn't matter. They would have to be transferred. One of the, I guess, advantages of it, if it's a case in the hospital, is they may already have done the scans and blood work, so they wouldn't have to repeat that at the forensic unit, and so we can issue warrants to seize all relevant investigations and use them as part of the death investigation.
In terms of COVID, has there been anything that's really changed significantly in your job?
I mean, the regional supervisor and the office of the coroner was incredibly supportive and accommodating, and they had made it very clear, if there's a scenario where you're not comfortable, we can kind of talk about how to do it safely or whatnot. Because in the beginning there was a lot more fear, and it was a bit different compared to now, right? And all of us were mailed like personal PPE supplies. So I had packages of gloves and masks and even some gowns that were sent to me so that I could use it. One of the nice things also that kind of timed well was much of our paperwork is all online. So even death certificates and, warrants, whatever, we can do them online. So that's helpful, less paper, less contact, whatnot. But it was a bit more scary in the beginning having to go to a decedent's house, because you have no idea what happened, why they died, did they have COVID, whatnot, but we were always well supported and protected, and we had PPE and whatnot.
And you'd still have some sort of index of suspicion in terms of testing out of hospital arrests and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so dying from COVID is not a coroner's case.
Yeah.
Right. But if a death investigation was being done, my only reminder would be, if you think it's COVID, just for public health purposes, as a statistic, just do the swab.
Yeah. Easy.
Before we transfer the decedent to the forensic unit. That would be it. But dying from COVID is not a coroner's case.
Yeah, remember that, people. For anyone out there that might be interested in becoming a coroner, there's actually quite a few merge docs. Coroners are involved in coroners in the coroner service. What should someone do? So
there's a 5-day course that's run every year. You can email whatever region you fall under or the region you want to work under, and they can give you the information for the course. It's a 5-day course, and after that you can pick up shifts.
Oh, and are they mostly hiring?
Well, the way I did it was I did the course, and then I informed the region, that I am now a coroner who can work in this course, and then they would ask for my availability, and I send them the dates, and then I don't always get the dates that I requested because there's a bunch of us. But and I'm not working like 15. I'm not doing 15 coroner shifts a month, so I only do a few. So usually I get what I request, which is.
Oh, that's nice.
But I'm not doing very much. Maybe if you wanted to do a lot more, it might be an issue. But if you're just doing a few, I don't anticipate an issue at this time.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. All right, well, I think that covers most of what we were thinking about talking about today. So thanks so much, Amna, for your insight into the coroner's world. Yeah. And we'll be touching base with you again, I'm sure, for some other topic in the future.
I'm happy to chat if anybody has other questions or just want to ask about how it works. I'm available.
Yeah, and actually, maybe if you're okay with it, we'll put your email address in the show notes if anyone has questions for you. Perfect. Well, great. Thanks so much.
Welcome to Residence Corner, where you will learn about some of the awesome work that our McMaster Emerge residents have been up to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Residence Corner this month. This month, we'll be talking about personal finance tips for residents. And for this episode, we have one of our very own PGY3s who has a previous life in finance. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Beatrix Bertzi.
Hi, everybody. Spencer, thanks for having me.
Can you just give us a brief introduction to yourself and your experience in finance?
Sure. So I'm Beatrix Bertzi, and prior to medicine, I spent a decade in business and finance. So the better part of which was spent as a certified financial planner, helping folks identify and reach their financial goals. So in other words, I helped people with budgeting, saving, tax planning, investments, and insurance and estate planning.
Sounds like a lot of things that physicians probably need to know about. So you're probably a big step ahead for the rest of us.
It is helpful.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, we're all residents and we're just starting to make a little bit of money. Where should residents begin when they decide to start considering personal finance? And what would you say the first steps for the residents would be?
This one's actually a lot easier than most people think. Save 10% of each pay towards long-term goals like retirement. So I'd start by looking at your income, look at how much comes in each pay, and set up an automatic withdrawal for 10% of it to go into your savings for the same day. So if you earn about $2,500 each pay, then set up $250 as an automatic savings plan. This money's for your future, so round up. So if you make $2,484 in a pay, still set aside $250. Now, people will no doubt be wondering where to invest this money or whether to put it into investments under their RSP or their TFSA, or if it should go into ETFs or mutual funds or bonds. And the short answer at first is it doesn't matter. Just set it up so that you start the habit and continue to increase how much you automatically set aside as your income increases each year. So stick to the 10%. If you do nothing else, this will already make a huge difference to where you end up in the long run. Ideally, you will do more. So the next step is to budget, write out all the money that comes in, and then write out all the money that comes out. With your expenses, the stuff that comes out of your account each month, you should start with the stuff that is pretty much the same every month. This is called your fixed expenses. It includes your rent or mortgage, your phone bill, your internet bill, your CMPA monthly fee. Even though we get most of it back, it still comes out each month, and whatever other fixed expenses you have. Then subtract your fixed expenses from your income. If you get a negative number, you have more expenses than income, you will actually be behind, and you're unlikely to do the most important first step that I mentioned earlier, which is setting aside 10% of your pay. So if your number is negative, you either have to cut back on something or make more money. It's that simple. If you had a positive number, you make more than you spend, then whatever you have left over after you subtract your expenses and your savings is your monthly disposable income. Go nuts.
I hope that I'm in the positive, but sometimes I feel like I'm definitely in the negative. I'm just wondering. You mentioned there the 10% for saving. What do you think about those who are considering using money to pay off their debt? Would you use some of that 10% to pay off your debt, or is that like a different portion of the money that you should be spending?
So that would be a different portion. So people are often wondering how they would balance their debt versus their investing. And the most important thing in order to balance the two is to stop accumulating more debt. So live within your means, which is why that budgeting step is so important. And once you can do that, you will have to start repaying any debt that you've already accumulated. And many people want to pay off their debt first. And they'll say things like, I'll pay off my debt now at double the speed, and then I'll worry about investing. Meanwhile, life will always find more reasons for you to have more debt. So you needed to replace your car, or you decided to buy your first house, or you had kids, you bought a bigger house, etc. And the next thing you know, it's 20 years later, and you're still paying off debt, and you haven't touched your investments. So hopefully that won't happen to any of our listeners here, because they'll have heard the first and only thing worth doing, which is to set aside the 10% of your pay towards long-term savings. But as long as you have debt, the next step after the 10% is for you to devote a percentage of your income towards debt repayment. I usually recommend 20%. I would never spend more than 20% towards paying off your debt, and try not to spend less, and find a way to live within 70% of your means now. If you can do that, you'll live beautifully for the rest of your financial lives. And so that 20% is kind of part one. The second part of debt is to consolidate it. It's just as important as starting to repay it with sort of 20% of your income. Consolidating your debt into the lowest possible interest is going to make a big difference. And you have some clout now, so shop around at your bank, at other banks, and find the lowest interest lines of credit that are available and avoid getting charged those ridiculous fees. Anything more than I'd say prime plus 2% is too much. Most of us could probably get prime plus 0.5 or less.
That's great advice. You're throwing around a lot of numbers, and it's like seems like it might be a lot of math. So I'm wondering if you recommend using any financial services, or if you think that residents can do this on their own. Because I know, there's a lot of the services out there that are presented to us from our banks or from like MD Financial Management. Do you think those things are necessary, or can we, for the most part, handle it on our own?
I would always strongly recommend getting a financial advisor. So yes, definitely use the services. Feel free to shop around until you find someone that you're really comfortable with. Ideally, someone that starts by going through your budget with you. Someone that encourages you to set up a percent of each pay and then talks to you openly about the difference between putting your investments within an RSP or TFSA or non-registered accounts, RESPs for kids. That stuff can get really complicated. And the nitty gritty of it is not something that you need to really worry about. It's good to have someone in your corner that worries about it for you, the deadlines, etc. Avoid anyone that brings up a whole life insurance policy for squirreling away your money. They're taking advantage of you, and you'll spend more money trying to get out of it than you ever would have made. Also, avoid anyone who isn't able to explain everything that they want you to buy in really plain language. If you don't understand it, don't buy it.
That's really good advice. I've heard a lot about the whole life insurance policies, and I think I've been warned by enough people about that, so hopefully I don't fall for that. Now, you mentioned RSPs, TFSAs, and RESPs. Do you have like a recommendation for residents? Should we be investing in our TFSAs or RSPs or both, or any strategies that you recommend for that?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, invest in all of it. The long answer is kind of long and complicated and best explained in person by your advisor over and over again. What makes it a long answer starts in the name. I'd say most people listening to this probably think that a TFSA, so a tax-free savings account, and RRSP, a registered retirement savings plan, are products that you go to the bank and you buy. But they're not products. They're vehicles where you carry your investments. So one analogy is to think of investments as patients, and TFSAs, RSPs as air and land ambulances. So both the air and land ambulance get the same patients to the hospital. They just take different routes. Same with TFSAs and RSPs. Both will get you to your destination of retirement, and what you invest in can be exactly the same. So for example, you can buy Scotiabank stock and hold it in your TFSA or your RRSP or both, and how they get you there is a little bit different. So the main difference between the two is how you get taxed. With the TFSA, you get taxed on the way in. With the RSP, you get taxed on the way out. Both let your money grow tax-free, which means you don't pay tax on growth each year. And if you do it right, there actually shouldn't be really much difference between the two. But this is where an advisor can come in handy. So as a resident, I don't pay tax, not yet anyway, because of my exorbitant tuition credits. So I don't worry about getting taxed on the way in, which means that all of my investments are currently traveling via the TFSA for now. When I'm staff, I will welcome a tax break on the way in, and so I'll be leaning more towards my RRSPs. But realistically, I'll probably try to maximize both annually whenever I'm able. And because I know that I will get taxed on the way out in the RRSP, I'll look at my portfolio as a whole, and I'll treat all of my investments as if it's one large investment. And I'll put the slower growing things in the RRSP and the faster growing things in the TFSA. And what I mean by that is based on how tolerant we are to risk, We will want stuff in stocks versus stuff in bonds. So stuff that has lots of risk versus stuff that has very little risk. And that stuff with little risk has very slow, predictable growth. And the stuff with lots of risk has potential for higher, more unpredictable growth. And what I would do is I would have the stuff that has the potential to grow more sit in my TFSA, and the stuff that has potential to grow maybe a little bit less sit in my RRSP. And overall, my portfolio will be balanced for my risk tolerance. Now, if that sounded really complicated, that's because it can be, which is why I find it really helpful if this isn't second nature to you because you didn't spend a decade in finance like I did, that you have an advisor that you trust, that you can check in with every 3 to 6 months and just sort of look at your investments together and talk about sort of an overall plan as opposed to just, I'm going to set this money in here.
Yeah. Just throwing money in something without understanding it, I guess. It is the main premise, from my understanding, the RSP, that you'll be taking your money out at a later time when our incomes will be lower and our tax brackets will be lower. Is that kind of the purpose of that?
That is the main premise. In my experience, most people, once they're retired, don't like to live a worse lifestyle than while they were working. If anything, they're bigger spenders. And so their income is usually needed to be about the same, if not higher. So often people that were making $300,000-400,000 a year in their working lives are still requiring $100,000 to $200,000 a year to pull out to now pay for their retirement. They're not in a lower tax bracket.
Interesting. I never thought of it like that. Slightly concerning. Yeah, no, that's really good advice. I'm just wondering, you've said a lot of things that I think are very helpful in understanding some of the common questions. Do you have any suggestions on what residents should do to prepare for the rest of their lives, like on top of what we've talked about already?
I'd say, sort of going back to the financial advisor concept, preparing for the rest of your financial lives is all about teamwork. You'll need the financial version of a multidisciplinary team working for you. So a good tax advisor will be your most valuable asset. That's where most of your money will go. So ideally an accountant who works with your financial investment advisor to making decisions that make sense for you. If you have children, you'll want a good estate plan, which will include a comprehensive insurance portfolio and a will and power of attorney documents for both property and health. And you'll want to get all these people in the same meeting at least once so that everybody's on the same page with you. As residents, you can already get some of the ball rolling on this. So you can meet with a financial advisor or 5, depending on how comfortable you were with the first one, and start to discuss where that 10% of each pay should go. You can also already start to put together a strategy for your taxes come staff life. If you do nothing else, go into your account and set up the 10% of each pay to be pulled on the same date as your pay comes in. Even if you simply send it into like a savings plan, it really doesn't matter. Just start the habit now as a resident and you can figure out the rest later.
Yeah, I think I came into this feeling like I had some idea of what I was doing, but now I'm wondering if I should be getting a financial advisor as well. So, I mean, just to summarize everything, it seems like the main messages are getting a financial advisor can actually be very helpful, even though you may think you know what you're doing. And then saving that 10% and trying to put 20% of your paycheck into your debt as well, but also saving at the same time. And then when choosing between a TFSA and RRSP, might be a discussion for your financial advisor, but at the baseline, the answer was yes to investing in them. So hopefully it works out regardless of what you choose to invest in. Does that seem like a reasonable summary of everything that you mentioned?
Absolutely. You got it. If everybody gets it this way, then you guys are set.
Yeah. You make it sound simple but complicated at the same time. So
Hopefully more simple than complicated.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I know it's nice. We've had a couple of talks from you about this kind of thing. So it's nice for the resident group to have you as a resource for us. So I really appreciate you joining the podcast today. So thanks for your time and your advice.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the MacEmerge podcast. We hope that this brings you new information and helps you up your game so you can deliver better patient care to our region.
Remember, we are always looking for new talent and expertise to feature in our podcast.
So if you're interested, please feel free to contact us at our email at macemergepodcast@gmail.com. We're also looking to improve your experience, so please submit your feedback as well.
Again, thanks for listening. Let's all stay connected.
MacEmerge out!